right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's session from the MACC Hub, talking about our recently launched flexible fund funding opportunity. Today's session is an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the call, what is expected within the application, and hopefully to provide a bit of advice and help for those of you who might be interested in participating. We still do have some people joining the session, but the session is being recorded, so you will be able to access everything afterwards. And please do keep your microphone muted and feel free to have your cameras off for now. The session for the first half is very much us telling you a little bit about the call and what the application process is like. And then we'll be going to breakout groups to help with some matchmaking and some development of relationships and collaborations that might be helpful for anybody interested in applying for this fund. As I mentioned, the plenary session is being recorded, so that can be shared afterwards. And any questions that you might have, please do post them in the chat, and members of the MACC team will be collating those and we'll post those to us at the end of the presentation session. And feel free to also use the chat to introduce yourselves and to start building those relationships as well, if you'd like to do that. So today's session will run till about 12 o'clock. We will give you a short introduction to the MACC Hub and the programme of work that we're delivering through that, and then also to the flexible fund opportunity itself. There'll be some time for Q&A after we've talked you through that process, and then we'll, as I said, break into Sandpit and networking sessions to allow you to have some conversations with others who might be interested in being involved in any applications that you might have. And there'll be a short summary and wrap up at the end. I didn't introduce myself. I should have said I'm Emma McKinley. I'm based at Cardiff University and I'm the co-lead of the Welsh Spoke for the MACC Hub, alongside Alice Morris and Camilla Curry from the Severn Estuary Partnership. And to start with, though, for today's session, we'll be handing over to Helen Adams from King's College London, who is our project lead, and we'll be talking you through a bit of an introduction and overview to the MACC Hub before we go into the kind of background of the flexible fund and what the application of that process would be. So Helen, over to you. Just let me know when you would like me to move your slides.
Amazing. First slide, please, Emma. Good morning, everyone. Yep, some of you might have seen me. I'm Helen Adams and I lead the MACC Hub from KCL, but as Emma has pointed out, we're an all UK effort with a kind of hub spoke model with representatives in each of the 4 nations. Next slide, please, Emma. So what are we? We're a knowledge exchange and synthesis hub. So there is some, and as you'll see through this call, there is some original research, but our main goal is to synthesize, coordinate, bring people together to draw out the knowledge on what works on adaptation in the UK. So that's kind of what this slide shows. We are about unlocking transformative change for a well-adapted UK. So we want to bring together the UK adaptation community. There are a lot of existing networks, there are a lot of existing work. We want to bring those networks together, share best practice. We want to draw out and share what works on adaptation. So we're really about, we're not about hazards, we're not about risk assessments, we're not really about vulnerability assessments, to be honest. We're actually about like the doing of adaptation, which is kind of, someone said it to me, sort of adaptation 2.0, like what works fundamentally was the question posed by DEFRA and UKRI when they launched the call for the hub. We support the National Adaptation Programme process and the devolved versions of the National Adaptation Programme in both their creation and their implementation. And I think it's, to me, if you think in the UK context, we sit between the CCC and the Climate Change Risk Assessment and the National Adaptation Programme that responds to that with advice on how to do adaptation, basically. But for us, and this is where the transformative comes in, we want to drive a well-adapted UK that centres vulnerability. So for us, this idea of transformational adaptation, or adaptation that addresses the root causes of vulnerability, that basically looks at structures as well as kind of the hazards themselves, that's really central to what we do. And so we take a place-based approach in lots of what we do. Thanks, Emma. Next slide. We have 5 key objectives. And so you'll see from these that we aren't sectoral, we're sort of about structural and cross-cutting barriers to adaptation. We want to create an enabling environment for adaptation within the UK, and these are our 5 objectives to sort of reach that goal. The first is about awareness and engagement. So how do we talk about adaptation? How do we engage in adaptation? How do we get people, organizations, and different stakeholders thinking about adaptation who aren't already? The second is about, I mean, the whole of the hub is about kind of learning and kind of adaptive processes as we learn as we go. But there's also this element of learning and sharing between the different nations of the UK. And there are things going on in Wales, for example, with the Wellbeing of Future Generations and with the Just Transitions Commission in Scotland. And we want to learn from these because they're very, very relevant to adaptation. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel when there are these quite progressive and transformative policies in place. The third goal really focuses on system complexity, cascading risks, cross-sectoral risks, the ways in which we can't just focus on one sector, we can't just focus on one policy area because everything's interconnected. And how do we get people and help create an understanding and a way of approaching adaptation that takes that into account? The fourth one's about policy, legislation, regulation, kind of getting policy coherence, removing bottlenecks, seeing where we can align processes to actually enable adaptation across the UK. And finally, the last one's about data and modeling, not so much producing models, but actually how do we make model outputs more useful for those who need to make decisions at multiple scales. Next slide, please, Emma. I think, Emma, can you just skip forward? I'm not sure how many slides I've got. Have I got one more after this? Yeah, okay, great. So skip back for me. Thank you, Emma. So basically, this is us. We are, some of you might recognize some of the institutions on this. This is who are in the hub. But I put this slide up mainly, I mean, to show you who we're working through, who we're engaging stakeholders through, but basically to make the argument that we're using this funding call to really enhance and to grow the MACC community. So, you know, anybody who's already in MACC can't go for this funding. This is really for us to grow, to increase that network and to engage with people who maybe haven't even engaged in adaptation before, because you can sense from a vulnerability-centered approach that actually many things that are social justice, grassroots, community-oriented are, for us, a form of transformational adaptation. But, you know, you might know some of the organizations that are on here. Next slide, please. And finally, this is what we're doing. We're building a knowledge portal slowly and in a co-produced kind of fashion. So our website doesn't really give that much information on who we are. So this is what we're doing. And we've got 4 key pillars that are activities that we're using to create this enabling environment for transformational adaptation. The first one is about skills and partnerships. So we've got work on training and capacity building in both things like using climate data. So how do we get people in organizations feeling more empowered and able to use climate data to make decisions, and in kind of leadership training in systems thinking. So how do we get those who have the decision-making power in organizations to really be able to see across sectors, across scales, you know, across timeframes, and to think about trade-offs and co-benefits. The second pillar is very much about knowledge generation and sort of where can we fill knowledge gaps that help advance adaptation. So we've got work with OpenClim using this. It's like a climate model that you can downscale to get quite fine scale risk maps. So we're working with stakeholders to improve those. We've got knowledge sprints to fill key gaps in adaptation that can help us address bottlenecks, and each of our spokes has hub-led research that will help us meet our 5 key objectives. Well, then obviously all of us is about linking knowledge, policy and practice. That's kind of what the whole thing's about. But we have a policy response unit, which if we had flexible funding in the MACC hub, the main chunk is coming to this funding call. Another chunk is a policy response unit, and there's a call out for that at the moment. And I hope someone can put that in the chat, because the deadline for this has been extended to Monday. And so we're looking for early career researchers and PhD students who would like to support DEFRA and the devolved administrations on their policy questions. We've got policy labs, which are methodologies to kind of bring people together to address sort of policy bottlenecks. And like I said, we're building a knowledge portal, which we hope will be really useful for people, not just another website. And then finally, the last thing is a flexible fund. And this is really about going out, I think it's probably the closest we come to kind of public engagement in a sense, although it's not, but go wide, trial transformative adaptation. Let's give adaptation a go and learn from doing, but we'll hear more about that from Emma. I'll leave it there, Emma. I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much. And Camilla's just put the link to the policy response unit application in the chat as well. So thank you very much for that, Helen. There will be an opportunity for people to ask any questions from Helen when we open that part of the session. So thank you for that overview. And now my slides aren't moving. Ooh. So next up, we've got Lizzie Fuller, who's going to speak to us about, I guess, the climate risk and adaptation landscape, just to provide a bit of that broader context for this flexible fund call and where we're working as the kind of broader MACC hub. So Lizzie, I'm sure I've seen you. If you would like to switch your camera on and unmute yourself.
Hi, Emma. Can you hear me?
Hi, I can hear you. Yes.
Perfect.
Great. Okay, just let me know when you'd like me to move your slides.
Perfect, will do. Thanks so much for having me, and great to hear more from Helen about the MACC programme as well. It's very exciting. So yeah, as Emma said, my name's Lizzie and I'm a senior analyst in the Climate Change Committee. So I'm working on the 4th Climate Change Risk Assessment. I'm very new to the role, so thanks to my colleagues for their support with slides. So as Emma said, I'll be talking about the climate risk and UK landscape for climate adaptation. Next slide, please, Emma. So the CCC are an independent body, and we were set up as part of the Climate Change Act with a role to advise government. Our statutory remit covers carbon budgets, climate risk assessments, and also progress reporting. So carbon budgets, of course, set the pathway to net zero by 2050, with the most recent CP7 published in February earlier this year. On the adaptation side, the climate risk assessments provide an understanding of course, UK climate risk, and we're currently working on the CSRA 4 independent assessment, which is due in mid-2026. And of course, we also regularly provide progress reports that assess both progress on adaptation and mitigation. So the adaptation reports are published every other year, and the most recent one was published in April. So next slide, please. So under the Climate Change Act, there is a regular governance structure for adaptation. So every 5 years, the committee provide an independent assessment, and government then respond to that with their climate change risk assessment, followed a year later by the National Adaptation Programme. So currently, we're in the stage of preparing the independent assessment evidence base. So next slide, please. So of course, this is familiar to everybody, but I think it's always useful to frame where we are within the wider context of climate change. So this graph of course, shows a time series from observation centres around the world, with the smooth black line showing us the average warming. And as we can see, we are rapidly approaching the key 1.5 degree lower threshold for the Paris Agreement. And the next National Adaptation Programme may very well be implemented within the period where temperatures are 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. And as we know, it's adaptation that must prepare us for that warmer world. So our committee emphasised that adaptation is a near-term challenge, with continued global warming leading to impacts that can only be reduced in the short term through that adaptation action. Next slide, please. So next up, I'll focus on the CSRA 4 independent assessment. So the last one was published in 2021, and as I say, we're preparing the next one for mid-26. And the independent assessment provides authoritative, evidence-based and up-to-date insight for government. So the report has a particular focus on providing assessment that is useful and usable for decision makers, particularly for government, but also across levels. So next up, I'll show the breakdown of that independent assessment on the next slide, please. So the first component is the technical report. So the tech report answers the key question of what are the risks that need to be managed. So the current one is being led by a Met Office consortium, and it's essentially an independent evidence synthesis. And it provides an update of the key risks and opportunities to the UK from CSRA 3, and assesses the urgency of taking further action. The second component to the independent assessment is the well-adapted UK report, And this takes the outputs of the tech report and looks at answering the key question of what actions are needed to manage these risks. So it's new and it's being delivered by the CCC, and it's both a synthesis of published evidence along with collating some bespoke research as well. And together these two components make up the independent assessment. So next slide, please. So I mentioned the technical report, and these are the 45 new risks and opportunities. So these cover 5 key sectors of society that we call outcome areas. So this includes the built environment, economy, health and well-being, infrastructure, and land, nature, and food. So this is the new simplified 45 set of risk and opportunities. Next slide, please. So if I move on from the independent assessment, I thought it would also be useful to highlight some of the key outcomes and messages from our recent progress report. So for the progress report, we monitor progress within several systems. So here is an example for water, where we are looking to assess the outcome of a plentiful supply of water for people. And when we show the required outcome underneath this, we explore the required outcomes, the enablers, the policies, and also the contextual factors that affect climate risk, so things like the changing climate hazard. And this whole conceptual framework we refer to as a monitoring map. So to monitor the UK preparedness to this outcome, we assess both the delivery and implementation of adaptation actions, as well as assessing the quality of adaptation policy and plans. So that's both assessing the delivery and implementation of actual adaptation action and assessing the policy and plans. So the monitoring maps are a useful place to look for an understanding of gaps within the wider adaptation landscape, including research gaps. So next slide, please. So if we look at delivery and implementation, in our assessment, our clear conclusion is that adaptation implementation remains inadequate. So we didn't find a single outcome area that had evidence of good delivery on adaptation. So overall progress is slow, stalled, or heading in the wrong direction. And this is a particularly important evidence gap, as monitoring and evaluation remains a blocker for assessing risk. So we often find that there's a lack of understanding of how an intervention may lead to risk reduction due to a lack of good indicators. Next slide, please. So here we can see policy and plans. So here we're doing slightly better. So while some level of adaptation planning exists in most areas, we find that high quality adaptation planning is still lacking. So only 3 of the outcome areas are achieving good policy and planning scores, and these good scores are within the infrastructure sector. So again, there are evidence gaps around making good adaptation plans that can usefully be supported by the research community. Next slide, please. So I'll finish up with the 4 key messages from our progress report that summarise some of these findings. So the first is around a requirement for improving objectives and targets. So the committee feel that it's vital to provide an actionable and measurable framework for adaptation progress. Secondly, they also provided the steer of requiring improving coordination across government. So adaptation and climate risks are still only weakly integrated into wider government resilience efforts and other key policy agendas. They also requested a focus on integrating adaptation into all relevant policies. So government's policy agenda can help to close key policy gaps, but only if climate resilience is adequately incorporated to their forthcoming strategies and plans. And finally, as we've discussed, implementing monitoring, evaluation and learning across all sectors is required. So adequate monitoring and evaluation underpinned by regular data collection and reporting is essential to track climate impacts and the effect of adaptation measures at the national level. So it's also needed to ensure that future planning learns from what is effective. So that key part of learning is really important here. So that's my final slide, and hopefully this has provided some food for thought on wider adaptation landscape and possible research opportunities. Thanks. I'll hand back to Emma.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. Thank you for that overview, and really helpful to kind of hear some of those gaps and where we think there might be opportunity to hopefully contribute not only through the Flexible Fund, but of course through the wider MACC programme that Helen talked us through. So thank you for that really valuable overview. And again, if anybody does have any burning questions for Lizzie, please feel free to put them in the chat and hopefully she'll be able to respond to some of them. And if not, we'll also, as I said, have some opportunity for Q&A, which will be more about the Flexible Fund process itself. But yeah, there might be some opportunity for some questions as well. We have a hand up. Lucy?
Sorry to interrupt, Emma, but for me, the chat is turned off. And I don't know if it's Lucy specific or for everybody, but I just thought I would raise that.
Yeah, the chat is quite active, so I don't know.
Okay,
I'm
so
having
it
the
is
same
just...
problem.
Oh,
Sorry. If you can't put your question in the chat, that's no problem. If you do have a question, put your hand up and I'll make sure to come to you. That's not a problem at all. I've had that happen with Teams sometimes when my Wi-Fi connection isn't brilliant and it's switched off my chat. So, you know, it can be a bit unpredictable, but no problem. If you do have questions, if anybody can't access the chat, please put your hand up, and we'll make sure to get you that way. We won't leave you out. I think I also saw a question about whether the slides would be shared afterwards. Yes, they will be shared. I'm sure one of our team has also responded to that. Okay, so we're now moving on to an overview of the Flexible Fund and the application process that we've designed for this. As I've said, I've already introduced myself. I'm Emma McKinley, and I have been involved with a number of the team members to support the development of the Flexible Fund call. I will talk us through the goals of the Flexible Fund and then that application process. And I said there'll be time for Q&A at the end. I'm just going to change my gallery so I can do it afterwards. Okay, so the goal of the Flexible Fund is that it generates information on what works in terms of climate adaptation through a learning by doing process. As Helen said, we really want to test examples of what might work in terms of adaptation and how we can work towards effective adaptation solutions, and really centering those ideas of transformational adaptation at a range of different scales, and crucially really centering place-based approaches and engaging community groups, community members and non-academic partners. So we're not envisaging this being a research call necessarily. It's very much a set of projects that will be testing things and working at a community level. We are hoping that we'll be able to catalyse transformational climate adaptation, hopefully contribute towards some of those issues and those gaps and research priorities that Lizzie just talked us through by supporting a series of innovative and place-based adaptation projects, and really crucially fostering collaboration between academia, research institutions, policymakers, businesses, and community groups to really maximise the impact of those project outputs. Oh, no, my slides don't want to move. There we go. So in terms of what the proposals should seek to do, as I said before, they should be place-based and focus on specific geographical areas to ensure that they address local needs, priorities and challenges. Place is, we don't have a defined boundary of what we mean by the size or the scale of certain places. So it's just about ensuring that you really take that place-centred approach to proposals, and there's a rationale for that. Ensuring that projects are vulnerability focused and that there's clear consideration of groups and places most vulnerable to climate change across the UK, and specifically identify the vulnerabilities that are being addressed through the project. And those might be different in different places, of course. So really thinking about what vulnerability might mean in the context of your proposal and how your project will be addressing that. Ensuring that the project's linked to existing policy needs, and that there's a clear demonstration of the relevance to current or emerging policy needs and priorities at local, regional or national levels, depending on what scale is appropriate, and ensuring that there is a clear pathway for engaging with relevant stakeholders through your project. I've mentioned already that the project should really centre community engagement and demonstrate meaningful and effective collaboration with local communities, groups and stakeholders right from the outset of project design. And there should be particular attention to engaging those vulnerable groups most at risk from climate change in those areas, as mentioned in the previous slide. Ensuring that there are measurable outcomes of the project. So I'll come to talk about the scale and the length of the projects shortly, but they are relatively short because of the time frame available. But we still would like to see that there is a process to support measuring and understanding outcomes, and that there's prioritization of implementation of these by embedding that practical adaptation that was mentioned by Helen at the beginning, and we can kind of engage in that reflective process and think about what's working, what can we learn from these projects to support effective transformational adaptation solutions going forward. We would like the projects to generate valuable insights into the enablers and or barriers to transformational adaptation, and we'd very much encourage and welcome applications that centre innovative approaches, which could be arts-based methods, it could be technological innovations, creative approaches to support synthesis, dissemination and learning of the project. Yes, I will share slides. The project proposals should consider how to ensure the impact and scalability of the projects being proposed as well. So really thinking about how they will contribute to meaningful and sustainable outcomes beyond this kind of relatively short-term funding of the flexible fund projects, thinking about how we can reduce vulnerability and improve resilience and drive lasting change in the adaptation space going forward. So in terms of the funding available, in total there is a £550,000 pot available. We wanted to try and make this as beneficial and to have as much impact as possible, ensuring that we were reaching as many projects as we could. And so we have allocated a £55,000 maximum per project, aiming to fund probably between 10 and 12 projects. So the full economic cost of the projects can be £55,000, as is the way with UKRI funding. Research funding eligible institutions can claim for up to 80% of the full economic costs. And there's much more detail about that in the application guidance notes, and also in the kind of more easy read translation piece that the team have put together as well, to really explain what that means. And that projects should last for up to 12 months. So they don't have to be a year in length, but we're saying that they should last for a maximum of a year to allow us to do that learning and evaluation of those projects to feed into the final kind of evaluation of the whole MACC Hub, and ensure that we have an opportunity to learn those lessons through the programme of the MACC Hub, which runs until September 2027. Projects must be led by a UK organisation which is eligible to receive UKRI funding, and I've got a QR code for a link to the list of those organisations later on in the slides that you'll be able to access. And crucially, projects must involve collaboration between those research funding eligible organisations. So that could be universities, it's some of our research institutions and other groups. So single institution applications will not be considered. They must be a collaborative proposal, bringing in community groups, businesses, local authorities, whatever makes sense for your project, but it must be that collaborative piece. As I said, they must be a partnership, and a minimum of 30% of the total funding requested must be allocated to the non-research or the non-HEI partners. I'm seeing lots of questions coming up in the chat, so we'll come to those later. In terms of eligibility, so the lead applicants must have an employment contract which ends no earlier than the proposed timeframe of the proposal that you're submitting. So just ensuring that your lead applicant has that contract beyond that 12 months of that project, if that's how long you're going for. And ensuring that the applicants are not already affiliated with the MACC programme. So they're not one of the MACC Hub collaborators. You saw the partners that Helen put on the slide, but also not a member of the MACC Programme Advisory Group or the Hub Advisory Group or any of the MACC research projects. And again, there's a link to the description of the 6 funded research projects later in the slides as well, and we can share that information with you after today's session. Crucially, the lead applicant must also be able to demonstrate that they have the capacity to distribute the funds to all partners, but particularly the non-academic or the non-research funding partners and other relevant organisations in a timely and accountable manner, to make sure there's not long time periods between funding and being sent to all partners. So some key dates in terms of the process that we'd like you to have in mind. There is a mandatory expression of interest form that must be submitted by 5 p.m. on the 8th of August. And I'll talk you through that in just a second. All proposals must submit that EOI to be eligible to submit a final proposal. Full applications must be submitted by 5 p.m. on the 30th of September. And again, I'll talk you through the full application in just a moment. We'll then have an assessment by our review panel throughout October, which will then be, they'll then create a shortlist of the most highly ranked proposals. The Flexible Fund Working Group, it will involve the MACC Hub team, but also some of our Programme Advisory Group, will make the final decisions on the projects to be awarded, and they'll be announced in November of this year, with projects starting by the end of January 2026. The expression of interest form, as I said, is a mandatory part of this process to allow us to ensure that we've got the right people involved in the review panel, and we have an idea of how many projects we might get into the final submission. So as I said, it must be submitted by 5 p.m. on the 8th of August. Any partner can submit an EOI. So even if you are a partner who may not be eligible to lead, but you want to ensure that your project idea has been tracked and has been submitted, and that you'll do some work to develop those relationships and find that lead partner at a later date and throughout the application design process, that's fine. But it's just really important that we have those ideas submitted in the EOI by the 8th of August. The form is quite short, so there are details such as the name of the lead partner if you have it, and the name of the co-leads, a short project overview, so 300 words maximum. There's also a short section on the budget, the location, and I think that is possibly it. But again, we can share the link for the EOI in the chat later. But it's a very, very short EOI form, so shouldn't hopefully take too long to develop that. The proposal submission for the full application process, so this is for the application at the end of September. Applications can be submitted in written, audio or video formats. We wanted to make this as accessible as possible. So while there is a more traditional written form that you can submit, you can also submit your application through audio or video formats also. The written applications should of course use the form provided, and again those links will be circulated later and you'll have QR codes to access those later as well. In terms of guidance for anybody who would like to submit their applications using the audio or video format, these are just some kind of key pointers. So please ensure that the various sections do not exceed 3 minutes when it's equivalent to a 300-word answer, or 5 minutes for a 500-word answer, just kind of making sure that they align with those length requirements if you were writing your application. Aim to be as concise and clear when you're addressing the questions in your audio or video recordings, and please make sure that you're using commonly supported file formats to ensure we can access those files when you submit them and upload them as well. So for video, those would be MP4 or MOV files. Audio would be MP3 or WAV files. And just do please double check the quality of the recording to ensure that there's no distortion, or we don't miss any words, or it's not broken up anywhere, just to make sure we're getting the best version of your application as possible, that we don't miss any detail when we're reviewing your proposal. In terms of the full proposal application form, this is kind of a quick overview of the sections that are included within that. So of course, there's your project title, there's a short project summary, project objectives, start and end dates, the location of the project and the organisation, a 500-word description of the project and rationale, methods and approach, so description of the methodological approach that you'll take to deliver your project, what you expect the outcomes and the expected impact to be, how the project will be managed, how you'll consider equity, diversity, inclusivity in the project proposal. So really, again, thinking about those vulnerability components in there too. Any ethical considerations that might be appropriate for your project, the team's capacity and experience to deliver the project proposal, and then the total budget, how it's being allocated and a justification of resources. This sounds really, really detailed, but the sections are short. So although we're asking for a lot of the kind of information, the sections themselves aren't too long. So overall, it's not a huge application form. Proposals will be assessed based solely on the application form or the files that you submit. So please ensure that you've addressed the questions within the application form, and we won't be accepting any late applications. So please ensure that if you do want to submit to the Flexible Fund call, that you get that mandatory expression of interest form in by 5 p.m. on the 8th of August, and that you get the final application in for the end of September, so the 30th of September at 5 p.m. And then, as I said, the applications will be reviewed by an independent panel, which we're establishing right now and over the summer. This will include experts from a range of different sectors and geographies and places around adaptation. They will then support a shortlisting process through scoring criteria, which we're going to make available very, very shortly, so that you'll see how their projects are being evaluated. And then will be discussed by the panel and the Flexible Fund Working Group to kind of develop that final list of projects, which, as I said, will be announced in November of this year. So hopefully we'll be letting you know fairly quickly after the submission at the end of September which projects are going forward. In terms of the evaluation criteria, we'll be considering the overall alignment with the Flexible Fund call and consideration of key call criteria. So those are things like the vulnerability focus, the importance of community-led projects, those sorts of things. We'll really be thinking about that. Considering the approach and methodology and how do those approaches support transformational adaptation and replicability across the UK. The suitability and feasibility of the methodological approach and the relevance to current or emerging policy needs, as mentioned before. Ensuring that evidence of community-led initiatives and local benefits is described well within the project proposal, and that there is an engagement with vulnerable or underserved groups in the communities that you'll be working in. A description, of course, of the project management will be considered, and the value for money and the deliverability of the project. And then that final section on impact. So really thinking about the outputs and how we might be working towards identifiable outcomes and supporting impact going forward. And again, we know these are short-term projects. We know that achieving and delivering transformational adaptation on the ground in a 12-month project is very, very challenging. I'm not going to say impossible, but because we don't like to say that, but it's very challenging. However, what we want to see within these projects is those evidence of those pathways to success and evidence of those potential solutions being tested and further exploring some of those needs that we need to address in terms of the broader adaptation landscape. To ensure that we are complementing the broader MACC programme in terms of the 6 funded projects that are being delivered currently, and also some of the work that we're already doing, and another project, we'll be taking a very broad portfolio approach to ensure that we're getting a balance of the projects that are happening in terms of topics, so the types of topics that are being addressed, geographies and place types that are being explored. So that could be urban, rural, across all 4 UK countries. And thinking about coastal uplands, it's not just about the nation that you'll be doing the work in. It's also the type of place that we'll be considering as well, to make sure we have that balance across these. The scale of project implementation as well. So there may be some that are very, very hyper local and some that are slightly bigger scale. So we'll be taking that into account when we fund the projects as well. The sector, the policy area the project is the policy area that the project is addressing, and then also kind of inclusion of non-academic partners or non-research partners in the co-design and co-delivery of the project, and that focus on community collaboration, project design and implementation will be really centering in how we're thinking about these projects and ensuring we've got that balance across the UK. So we don't want to end up in a position, for example, where 10 out of the 12 projects are funded in Wales. As much as we would love to see that, we'll make sure that they are much more geographically spread out. In terms of engaging with the broader MACC Hub, so our hope is that the flexible funded projects, when successful, when going forward, will become part of the MACC Hub family, and you'll be very much invited to engage with the MACC Hub programme going forward. So the projects that are successful will be invited to attend the MACC Hub internal meetings, the ongoing webinar series that has just recently launched, and the annual conference. So this year's conference is happening in Edinburgh in September, and there'll be 2 more that happen, 2026 and one in 2027. So making sure that you're involved in that process and you have an opportunity to talk about your projects and promote your project outputs and an impact will be really central. And we would really like to invite and ensure that all of the projects are contributing to the overall monitoring and evaluation of the MACC Hub itself and feeding into that UKI reporting process that some of you will be familiar with. And if there are any of you who aren't familiar with that process, we'll be providing guidance and support to ensure that we're helping you with that as well. But we want to make sure that we are using the Flexible Fund projects to really try and capture those lessons learned and thinking about how we can scale those lessons learned up across the UK too. And that will take the form of a series of short interviews with the successful projects with the MACC team. So we'll be wanting to speak to project leads and also other members of the project team and the community groups that you're working with, and through a series of quite short interviews to gather those lessons. Completing short online diaries about that project delivery and project implementation through a platform called Endemo, and participating in a short debrief workshop towards the end of the project. So that will be later into the end of 2026 into 2027. And again, online briefing and support will be provided by the team within our own MACC Hub programme that are leading this, and we'll be in touch about that in more detail as required. So you can use the QR code here to find out more details about the funding call on the MACC website. And again, we'll send follow-up emails with all of these links in there as well if you haven't got access to that. So some of the FAQs, I've kind of come to the end of the main kind of body of my text, but I thought I would just cover some of the questions that came up in the previous Sandpit session that we ran last month, just to hopefully anticipate some questions that some of you might have. If there still are some questions that require clarification, that's no problem at all. So just to again clarify who is eligible to lead applications, any organisation eligible for UKI research funding can be a lead partner. In terms of how many partners can be involved in proposals, as many as is appropriate, but these are small pots of money. So do think about the feasibility of spreading money across your partners. And please remember that no single organisation applications will be considered. What does 80% full economic cost mean? So that means that projects are funded up to 80% of the full economic cost. So in an example, if a project costs £10,000, the funder will cover 8,000 of that. And that is the funding that the UKI research organisations, research funding eligible organisations are eligible to apply for. And again, there's much more detail in the guidance document and the translation document that the team have to provide more detail on that. What do we mean by transformational adaptation? This is a great question, and it came up as our first question last time, so I thought I would address it now. We're really thinking about how we can rethink what we mean by transformational adaptation and retaking different approaches to responding to climate change and shifting the way we think about adaptation to better manage climate risks and support resilience across our most vulnerable communities. So really centering those ideas of vulnerability and putting different values at the heart of decision making to deliver stronger, more connected communities, restore relationship with nature, and make sure that we all have a voice in shaping adaptive futures. So we really are embracing different ways of thinking about adaptation and how that might transform how we do things going forward. How can small short-term projects deliver transformational adaptation? Again, this comes back to this question that's been raised a few times about the scale and the size of the projects. We know that the call is a short-term or for short projects. That is one of the limitations really of the broader programme timeframe. And we know that transformational adaptation takes time. We want the projects to really focus on supporting effective pathways to transformational adaptation and testing those solutions, implementing things in action, and thinking about how we can learn lessons from them going forward. You can find out more about the existing MACC research projects using the QR code here. And again, as I said, we can send that link around later. And the slides will go around later too, so you'll have access to the QR codes. Is there help for finding partners? So there'll be a link to a matchmaking form that you can complete which we'll be using to develop a searchable database for you all to use to search for possible partners who are interested in projects that you're interested in, topics and areas that you're interested in as well. So we'll be trying to support that as much as possible. And of course, we have a networking session that'll be starting after a short break and coming up soon. And can you submit a mixture of video and written submissions? We've decided not to support a mix of applications just to ensure that we don't miss anything by, you know, some bits being written and some being video or some being audio. So please do stick to one format of submission when you're submitting your form, just to make sure that we don't lose any of your applications and it doesn't harm or, you know, have any kind of negative impact on your application and get lost. So that is all my FAQs that I could think of when I was going through the list from the last session. So I'd like to open up to the team now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then bring you all back, because all I can see is one person. So I'm going to try and bring everybody back, hopefully. So rest of the team, would you like to let us know about any of the questions that we'd like to talk through this morning?
Hi, Emma.
Hi.
So got a couple of questions have come through on the chat. So the
Right.
first one is there a limit to the percentage of the total that can go to the non-academic partners?
We haven't put an upper ceiling on the total amount that can go to the non kind of lead partner, essentially, or the non-research partners, academic partners. I think what would need to be considered in those sorts of cases would be ensuring that there is adequate budget and that it is justified to support their involvement in the project, really. So that's really the crucial thing. But there's no upper limit on that. I don't know, Helen, if UKRI have given any insight into what that might, if there was an upper limit, but not from any of the information that we've been given.
No, not at all. I think the balance will be about universities' internal budgeting, not to get into the technical details too much, but it'll be about recovering overheads and the 80% rules that I think will be the upper limit. But from our side, no upper limit.
Great, thank you.
Great. Next question is, am I right in thinking that government bodies like councils and combined authorities are not eligible to receive funding? They would be a non-academic partner, as I understand it.
You'd be eligible to they would be eligible to receive funding, but not to lead. If they're not on the UKRI research funding eligible list, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to lead a project, but they could be part of a partnership or a collaboration and could get funding.
Great. So yeah, they must work with a UKRI funding eligible lead partner to apply for this funding. Great. So the next one is, can SMEs as a technology provider be a partner?
Can't see why not. I think SMEs would be absolutely fine, and we definitely encourage engaging, collaborating with as broad a spectrum of partners as makes sense for your project. So SMEs would be fine within that.
Great. A bit on a question on sort of the language. So what does non-HEI/research partner mean? Does this include community-based organisations? And if so, is there a maximum for them?
Yes, that absolutely does. So so HEI stands for higher education institution. So they are our universities or our colleges that might fall under that umbrella term. We don't want the projects to be purely academic pieces of work. We really want to ensure that the Flexible Fund projects are centering collaboration between academics or research institutions with these community groups, with these businesses. So absolutely, community groups, local authorities, businesses, NGOs, non-government organizations can be part of that additional set of partners that aren't academic organizations.
And that sort of links into the question afterwards is, are we interested in projects engaging the private sector as main partners?
Yes, absolutely.
But not as main.
Yes, I was just going to say. So they could be your main collaborative partner, but unless they were on the list of UKRI research funding eligible organisations, they couldn't be the lead partner, but they could be one of your main collaborating partners. Absolutely.
Can I apply for the funding if my organisation is involved in the MACC Hub?
No. Well, it depends on what you mean by involved with, because obviously some of our organisations are very large, and I think we had some clarity on it would be more individuals. So an organisation like the Met Office, for example, or the Environment Agency could potentially be a partner as long as the individuals named aren't linked to any of the projects involved. I'm looking to Helen, and yeah, Helen's nodding for clarification on that.
Yeah, I'll let you struggle away there, Emma. No, it comes down to the kind of the rationale that we want to use this to extend the network. So, but yeah, we appreciate our institutions are big, and just because somebody in your university is involved with MACC doesn't mean everybody is. So yeah, as long as you aren't involved with MACC, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Great. Will feedback be provided on the EOIs, or are these mainly for the use of the MACC team so that they can plan assessment panels, etc.?
That's a great question. They are very much an internal process. We won't be sifting those as such. They're an internal process, but what we will do is check them for eligibility in terms of kind of topic and geography. So making sure they're UK projects, for example. But they are an internal process. We won't be able to provide feedback on the EOIs, but we will and do have intention to provide feedback on the full applications when they come in. So we will be making sure that you get feedback on those after the review panels.
Great. We do have a hand up.
Yeah.
Some people can't access the chat.
Exactly.
Hi there. Apologies if I missed it, but are international partners acceptable?
I haven't had that question before. Helen's looking like she might unmute.
Yeah, I'm going to say no on that one. I think the only exemption is Ireland. Like, we will accept the application from the whole island of Ireland, and
Right.
If the lead is in Northern Ireland, but other than that, no, it's a UK focus. Cool.
Okay, that's helpful.
I mean,
thank you.
You could argue, couldn't you, that we could learn from case studies overseas and it'd be interesting, but I think we're focusing in on the money, going to the UK on this, apart from Ireland.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Another one.
Yeah.
We've got a few more. Could you give examples of the types of projects you might be wanting to see?
Well, we debated this a lot because we kept it as broad as possible to allow for as many different ideas and suggestions about what adaptation might mean, because because the call is so open around sectors and geographies. So we don't have examples of what we're expecting projects to cover. Helen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Actually, to be honest, I zoned out there. What was the question?
Gotta love some honesty.
Question was, could you give examples of the types of projects you might be wanting to see?
Oh, in my defense, I was reading the next question to try and help. I think what we're looking, I think I would focus back in on the criteria, and that's what we're done. We want to fund on the ground adaptation action, or things that scale adaptation, that help us to learn about the doing of adaptation. And I think beyond that, we don't know what that looks like, because I don't think there's been a call out like this before. And I don't think anybody really quite knows what adaptation looks like. And that's the whole point of the MACC program. So my only advice would be, like, don't like, don't limit yourself, don't not submit because you don't think it fits, because it's just, can you make the argument that this is how we're going to learn to do adaptation, and keep thinking about, you know, what does the national government need to know in terms of doing adaptation better? What do practitioners need to know in terms? So yeah, I don't know. I think there will be diverse ones. I think there will be ones that will be about scaling up existing things. Some will probably have nothing to do with adaptation and will be about the kind of justice and the power dynamics and the equity element, and there'll be everything in between. So I would just say, don't limit yourself because you think there's something we're looking for, because we're not, actually.
Which is going to make the review panel really exciting. Got a couple more minutes for questions.
Yeah, we've got some more. So my question is, does the funding cover time buyout for academic and non-academic partners?
It can do, so that there is no, it's not one of those funding calls that doesn't allow for staff time. So it can be used for that, yes.
Great. So next one is around sort of the policy objectives. So there's two here that we can probably combine into one. So where can we find a digest of the current policy objectives that you would like calls to align with?
We will be ensuring, so the slides will be circulated, so you'll see some of those bits of information from Lizzie's presentation, but we'll also be able to include links on the MACC website, links to some of the policy priorities from across all 4 countries. But as Helen said, I mean, we're not focusing in on any particular areas of policy or any specific topics. This is broad, and it's about just, you know, in the proposal, providing that context for your project and being able to justify and rationalize that within the proposal. I hope that answered the question.
And then on the same sort of topic, so are the policy areas you want initiatives to engage with the same as those on your website, i.e. food price shocks, protecting urban spaces, nature-based solutions, climate adaptation, etc.?
Those are examples of some of those policy areas, but I wouldn't limit yourself to those policy areas. I mean, if there are other areas that you want to respond to, and that there are needs and research gaps and opportunities for your project to contribute towards those, again, as long as they can be justified and rationalized, then there's no reason why that couldn't be included. Helen's put her hand up, so we'll go to Helen for her to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I just think important here is the point you made, Emma, about a portfolio approach, which is what we're taking across, like what the MACC program is taking and what this flexible fund is kind of meant to do. And so really, we're not going to fund something that's already been funded under MACC. So it's kind of the opposite. If you can see something, obviously climate adaptation, yes, the whole thing's about climate adaptation, but that, you know, that Birmingham project that's about testing those approaches, yeah, we're looking for things that are different, that are filling gaps out there in the knowledge.
Great, thanks, Helen. We've got one hand up. Liv, so I'll come to you, and then I will stop us for a break. Liv, just come in.
Thanks, Emma. I was just wondering if projects looking at like longer term systems change and specific waste stream management, with the approach of better resource management utilisation, whether they would be in scope.
I don't think so. It sounds like it could be. Again, it's about really, I suppose, with those sorts of projects, it would be thinking about how they would contribute towards that transformational adaptation, and that it's testing some sort of adaptation solution and really testing that on the ground if possible. So I think, as Helen said, going back to those broader call criteria, ensuring that we've got that kind of place-based community engagement lens, and that focus on vulnerability would be really important in the project proposal as well. So I suppose it would be making sure that the project fits against those.
And is there like anywhere on the MACC hub, is there a kind of definition of what vulnerability looks like and means in different senses, or within different, like, are there different meanings to how vulnerability can be approached for this?
We have we have alongside the FAQ document, there's key terms described, so we'll make sure that those are made available, and I'm sure vulnerability is in there as well, of how we're defining vulnerability, and also transformational adaptation in there, so we'll make that available too.
Amazing, thanks so much.
No worries, thank you. And Helen, you popped your hand up too.
Yeah, it's just we had a webinar yesterday on vulnerability as well, so I wouldn't like to try and define it, especially after that webinar, but there was a really interesting discussion on how we engage with the term vulnerability a bit more critically, so it might be worth, that'll go up on the website soonish, so it might be worth keeping a lookout for that if you missed it yesterday as well.
Great, thank you. Oh goodness me, many hands. Liz, do you want to come in and you'll be our last question?
Thanks. So I've been texting with a friend who can access the chat and says it's really interesting. And I can't. So I was hoping that with your recording or some of the information you send out at the end, you can also include a transcript of the chat, please.
We can look into that. We'll definitely be capturing all the questions, and we'll yeah, we can look into that. We haven't had to do it before, but we can look into it. Great. Okay, thank you everybody. I'm going to stop us now for a break. If your question wasn't answered, please don't worry. We'll be trying to answer them in the chat, but also we'll be collating all of these questions and adding them to our FAQ document, which will be on the website. And it's kind of a bit of a living doc. We'll keep updating that as needed. So please don't think we haven't spotted it or we haven't captured it. We do have it. We just didn't manage to get around to it today. It may also be something that you can ask in your breakout groups if you are able to come back to us after the break. So I'm going to pause us now for 10 minutes. So please do come back at 11:15, and then we'll be breaking into groups to allow you to have some of those conversations and look at where you might be able to work with partners and talk a little bit about your ideas. And hopefully that will help with some of that matchmaking process too. So I will pause this now. Thank you very much and see you soon.